Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I am not a filmmaker. I have this little dog and pony show here on YouTube that I've cobbled together from not much technical knowledge and zero experience, which is the way I seem to do everything. And I've been fortunate enough to find my people, my tribe, and you all keep me going. But as a lover of film, horror film, and documentary film to be specific, I have always thought about what it might be like to make a movie. And I imagine that as a documentarian, there would be no greater thrill than to capture something totally unexpected on film. We see that from time to time. The first story that jumps to mind is Robert Durst of The Jinx. If you haven't seen that, you absolutely have to. The documentary filmmakers literally catch something on tape that's shocking. Today we are talking about a filmmaker who set out to tell one story and ended up telling a completely different story, a story much more shocking and much more demented than anything she could have dreamed up. This is the story of Peter Madsen, a famous Danish inventor who is the perfect example of why so many of us true crime lovers have trust issues. Peter Madsen, the man who had two faces, two personalities, and two lives. One he kept hidden for a very, very long time, but when it came out, it was almost too unbelievable to be true. This is the story of the murder of journalist Kim Wall, the story of the submarine murder. Let's get into it. – 2016. This is filmmaker Emma Sullivan. In 2016, she had decided to make a documentary film about inventor Peter Madsen. Emma was digging around on YouTube looking for interesting subjects, and she found a TED Talk. The man featured on this TED Talk was Peter Madsen, and he was talking about how he had privately designed and built 3 submarines, and now intended to build a rocket ship to launch himself into space. Emma Sullivan was immediately taken in by the story and knew she wanted to make a film about this man. Peter Madsen was born in 1971, and as a child, he developed an interest in rocket fuel and engineering. Peter was raised in a chaotic household. His father was 30 years older than his mother, a woman with 3 kids from different men, and whom Peter's father, Carl, was very abusive towards. Carl, Peter's father, abused him, and he abused his stepbrothers. But when Peter's mother, Annie, left his father during his childhood, Peter ended up moving back in with his father. Peter had become convinced that his mother was a terrible person, and after he moved back in with his father, he never spoke to his mother again. You all know what I'm going to say here. We see it over and over. Men who become violent later in life often have strained or overly enmeshed relationships with their mothers. Mothers that are usually abusive or maybe overly sexual. Mothers who are absent or neglectful. Yes, sometimes it really is all about the mother. Later on in life, Peter's biographer would state that Peter had the most vitriolic hatred for women he had ever seen. And it is his opinion that Peter's hatred for women stemmed from his hatred for his mother. And man, Peter hated women. Peter began designing and building rockets in his teen years, and people recognized his intelligence and his skill. Before long, he had some sponsors and job offers and a very bright future. Peter didn't thrive in college, and he couldn't stick with it. He often rubbed people the wrong way, and he began to lose some of his sponsorships. But he always found a way to continue with his work. He never finished school and has no formal education, but like a lot of inventors, he learned by doing things himself. In the 1990s, Peter became very interested in the world of submarine design. Over the years, Peter designed and built 3 submarines, which is an incredible accomplishment. He first built the UC-1 Freya, the first ever privately built Danish submarine. It made over 500 dives between 2001 and 2002. He then built the UC-2 Kraka and completed it in 2005. The UC-3 Nautilus was Peter's third and final submarine. It was first launched in 2008 and had cost about $200,000 to build. Peter then began devoting his time to the study of rockets. He founded Copenhagen Suborbitals with Danish architect Kristen von Bengtson the same year, 2008, and together they decided to begin designing and building launch pads and rocket systems. In 2014, Peter founded Rocket Madsen Space Lab and announced he was now determined to build a manned rocket ship. By this time in his life, Peter Madsen was quite famous in Denmark. He was a celebrity. The citizens of the country and other European countries knew of Peter and his accomplishments. He was often written about in magazines and occasionally made television appearances. And then, of course, Emma Sullivan found him on YouTube and decided to make a film about Peter. She contacted Peter by email and almost immediately got back a very dramatic reply. The two began talking about the film, and soon it was in production. Emma immediately found Peter to be a difficult subject to film. He was congenial and pleasant, but he enjoyed making bold and sometimes shocking statements like, "You're going to die anyway, it just depends on how much pain it will involve." He also liked to push people's buttons, and he very much liked to be in charge. Emma found Peter to be very inappropriate at times and often had to remind him that filming was her work, and while in her work environment, she needed him to be professional. Peter also liked to try and direct the film, and there were times that he and Emma butted heads. Peter had agreements with Danish colleges and institutions that allowed engineering students to get school credit for working with Peter. So Peter had a workforce of unpaid, very intelligent and eager people around him, helping him to accomplish his goals. It was a very successful and productive thing he had going, a workforce he didn't have to pay for, and a workforce that was excited about what he was doing. Peter Madsen really had everything an inventor could ever want. For about a year, Emma and her team of filmmakers followed Peter. They filmed him day in and day out, performing the mundane tasks of his everyday life. Peter lived and worked in his industrial workshop. He had constructed a small kitchen to make meals, and he slept in a corner of the workshop. Peter was married. He got married in 2011, and his wife worked in the film industry, so she was often away. And obviously, this unusual living situation didn't bother her. Peter just kind of lived in the workshop, and she was on the road a lot. The documentary film crew followed Peter and captured his trials and errors, his successes and failures, all the while intending to document this celebrated inventor's creation and hopefully his success, the success of launching himself into space inside a privately designed and produced rocket ship. Peter Madsen was celebrated as a modern-day Thomas Edison, an eccentric genius inventor who makes the impossible possible. But that was only a very small part of who Peter Madsen actually was. August 9th, 2017. The documentary producer, Emma Sullivan, gets a phone call from one of her crew members working on the Peter Madsen documentary. Peter had informed the film crew that a journalist, this woman named Kim Wall, would be taking a submarine ride with him. Kim was going to be writing a story on him, and Peter, always the showman, wanted her to experience for herself what it was like to ride in one of Peter's creations. The film crew wasn't shooting on the day of the submarine ride, so there isn't any footage of Kim Wall getting onto the submarine with Peter Madsen. There are simply a couple of snapshots of she and Peter standing in the hatch as they prepare to launch. Peter and Kim leave the port for what was assumed to be a quick dive of the submarine that would take a few hours so Kim could have the experience and get the information she needed to write her article about Peter. But that is far from what happened, and the film crew member is calling Emma to let her know there has been some developments. Kim Wall, the writer of the article that's taking the ride on the submarine, her boyfriend Ollie had been texting and calling Kim from 7 in the evening to 10 the previous night, and he had received no answer. Now, this was especially strange because Kim was expected at a party where she was the guest of honor that night. Kim had not come home, and she had missed her own party. After hours of not being able to reach Kim or Peter, Ollie called the Coast Guard at about 2:30 in the morning, and a search was initiated. The Danish police joined the search about an hour later. Around 10:30 the next morning, the submarine was spotted by a lighthouse worker who called the Coast Guard and alerted them to the submarine's location. A helicopter was sent, and Peter Madsen was plucked off the top of his sinking submarine by the rescue helicopter. Word quickly reaches the film crew that had been working very closely with Peter Madsen that something had gone awry, and they rushed to the dock where he was last seen launching his newest submarine, the UC-3 Nautilus. As the film crew stands on the dock, they capture each other's reactions with the cameras meant to be pointed at Peter. The film crew is distressed, and the news only gets more upsetting and unusual. They hear that the submarine had gone missing. At the time, the word of Peter's rescue hadn't reached them, so no one in their group knew where Peter Madsen was, and no one knows where Kim Wall is. Everyone begins to assume the worst, but then the film crew begins to receive text messages informing them that Peter Madsen has in fact been rescued from atop his submarine. There were some conflicting reports that a fishing boat had picked up a man who jumped from a sinking submarine into the ocean and swam to the fishing boat, but Peter was in fact rescued. Here you see Peter Madsen being brought back to port by the Coast Guard. He is safe and unharmed, and most importantly, he is alone. The first thing people wanted to know, where on earth was Kim Wall? Peter Madsen claimed he had dropped Kim off at the point of Rochelle Island around 10:30 the previous evening, and she hadn't been with him all night. Peter said after he dropped Kim off, he began experiencing mechanical problems, and then a valve failed, causing the main tank of the submarine to fill with water. He said he had worked on the vessel throughout the night, and when daylight broke, he began watching for passing boats to help him. Initially, people believed that Peter dropped Kim off and she had met with either an accident or some type of foul play unrelated to her submarine trip with Peter. But as the hours passed, suspicion shifted onto Peter Madsen. Kim Wall was nowhere to be found. The Danish police brought in this woman who is an expert commander of submarines, and she stated that submarines simply do not sink in the manner that Peter Madsen was claiming. She went so far to say that Peter could easily have saved the vessel by performing a few very simple tasks, and it was her opinion that Peter Madsen was lying. Now, Kim Wall, the missing woman, was a Swedish citizen. So at that point, the Swedish police got involved as well. No one can locate Kim Wall's phone, not even by pinging it. And of course, no one can locate Kim Wall herself. Neither her family nor her friends have heard from her or know where she is. The Danish Navy was then sent out to locate the sunken submarine. They sent GoPro cameras on leads into the vessel and confirmed that there was no one dead inside the sub. It was, in fact, empty. In the beginning, they were thinking that perhaps Kim had died on the submarine and Peter had sunk it to try to cover up her death. Something is not right here, and everyone knows it. Peter is acting strangely, and as police speak to the people closest to him, they know. Peter Madsen is lying. August 11th, 2017. Peter Madsen is arrested and taken into custody by the Danish police. In the Danish legal system, most first arrests are preliminary arrests. The arrested suspect is then taken before a judge, and the judge determines whether or not there is enough evidence to proceed to trial or not. Peter Madsen's DNA was obtained on the day of his arrest, and then he was given his first hearing. At this hearing, Peter claims that yes, Kim died on board his submarine, but that it was an accident. He claims there was a malfunction with the hatch, that the hatch door hit her, crushing her skull and killing her. He claims he was traumatized and held what he called an immediate funeral for Kim and then dumped her body overboard. This information was enough for Peter to be held, and at that time he was charged with negligent manslaughter. Now, that information in Denmark did not go out as public at the time, so at that point, no one knew what was happening behind closed doors. The information from the preliminary hearing was not made public until August 21st, and a lot of things happened before then. The police begin looking into Peter Madsen in a way that no one has ever looked into Peter Madsen. And what they find, you guys, Peter Madsen is a madman. Misogynist does not begin to describe what Peter is. He is a masochist. He is a demon. Investigators find on Peter Madsen's personal computer I have to be really careful of the things I say here. Films. Films that are not legal to possess. Films of lives ending. Those kinds of films. In these films, women are always the victims. In these films, they are decapitated, they are mutilated, they are tortured. They are killed in the most horrific ways imaginable. And Peter Madsen has watched them all multiple times. There are not only films, there are photos. Thousands and thousands of photos of women being degraded, harmed, tortured, mutilated, abused, and killed in ways that would cause most people to become sick. And Peter Madsen lived on this kind of content. He loved it. He was obsessed with it. And as word of who he really was spread, a lot of people began re-examining not only what they thought about Peter Madsen, but their own interactions with him. And suddenly, a lot of things began to take on new meaning. This woman was a friend of Peter's. One day she sent him a text message telling him that she was unmotivated and did not want to work. She joked that she needed Peter to threaten her in order to motivate her into working. Peter sent back a string of very graphic sentences in which he describes using a knife to hold to the throbbing pulse in her neck to force her to work. The filmmakers go back through their own texts and realize that as they were texting Peter to tell him they were on their way to come and film him, according to his own computer records, Peter is online looking up the terms girl, agony, beheading, and watching human beings dying as they are texting him, as the film crew is texting him. On the very day of Kim Wall's disappearance, there is an unsettling scene in the documentary that ends up getting made about this, where the boom mic operator is just adjusting Peter's microphone, the mic clipped to his collar, and as she is doing so, Peter is glaring at her, looking annoyed isn't the word, beyond annoyed. There's just something in his stare. He is imagining something as he looks at this woman. You can see it on his face. He's looking at this woman standing inches from him, touching him, and he's thinking about something very dark happening to her. You can just see it on his face. Business owners on the point of Rochelle Island, the place where Peter said he dropped Kim, come forward and are asked by police for surveillance footage, anything that would show Kim Wall being dropped off at any port by Peter Madsen. Anyone with a camera near the ports check their recordings and no one finds a thing. Peter Madsen is lying. He never dropped Kim off on the island. He was never there at all. The filmmakers then notice something incredibly unsettling. They go back through their footage of Peter's workshop, the hangar in which he builds his creations, and they realize something in the far background is different on the day of Kim's disappearance. Every time the film crew has filmed at the hangar, there had been a very brightly colored orange-handled handsaw hanging on the pegboard above Peter's work desk. On the day of the submarine ride, the day Kim Wall goes missing, before the submarine ride even takes place and before Kim arrives to board the vessel, the saw that's always on that pegboard has disappeared. Peter Madsen was preparing for what he was about to do, and now they had proof. Danish investigators continued to gather evidence, and even without knowing what had happened to Kim Wall, prosecutors felt it was enough. Peter had been spiraling for some time, and at last his time was up. Investigators and the Coast Guard worked together to raise the UC-3, the sunken submarine, out of the water, which was an extensive process. They drained over 9,000 gallons of water from the vessel and began to investigate the inside of the sub. It was an absolute mess inside. Even though the submarine had sunk, parts of it remained watertight. So this isn't like a sunken ship. It was still dry inside. Authorities found blood. They found chunks of human tissue, and they found Kim Wall's belongings, including her bag and her jacket. Experts were brought in who confirmed that the submarine had been sunk intentionally. There was no malfunction. The creator had destroyed his own creation. On August 21st, 2017, a human torso washes up on the coast of Amager, the island portion of Denmark that is most densely populated. The public is shocked to hear of this, but it gets more shocking. The torso has been slit and punctured through in an effort to ensure it will not retain any air or gases, to ensure that it will not float. Pieces of scrap metal have been strapped to the torso in an attempt to sink it as well. Even before they did DNA testing, because Denmark is like the safest country outside of maybe Iceland and New Zealand, they don't have murders there very often, so they were pretty sure it was Kim. Sadly, they were correct. On August 23rd, DNA results proved the torso belonged to Kim Wall. Authorities then brought new charges against Peter Madsen, which included indecent handling of a corpse and mutilation of a corpse. The Danish police brought in special teams of divers, and I find this absolutely fascinating. This is mind-blowing. They brought in special teams of dogs that can hunt smells in the ocean. Explain this to me. Explain it to me like I'm 5. How do mammals that live exclusively on land smell things in the water? I know. There's an explanation. There's a scientific explanation. To me, this was like, I love this stuff. I love learning new stuff. And that one was mind-blowing to me. Dogs can smell underwater. Who knew? But anyway, they're all searching for the rest of poor Kim Wall, this beautiful journalist who had devoted her life to covering stories all around the country. This woman was really an incredible person with a love of life and a love of documenting interesting and incredible stories. And that's all she was trying to do when she asked to interview Peter Madsen, asked to interview who she thought was a man that turned out to be a monster. On September 5th, Peter Madsen went to trial. Apparently, they don't mess around in Denmark. Peter asked that his trial be open to the media and the public, because how else does a narcissist make sure they stay the center of attention? He testifies at his trial because, of course he does. He's the most interesting man in the world in his mind. Who wouldn't want to hear him speak? And he tells this story about how the hatch slipped from his hand and came crashing down on Kim Wall's head. He said, "It was a terrible accident, a disaster. No doctor could have done anything. Kim's head was severely injured and there was a pool of blood where she landed. I touched her neck, but she had no pulse." Now, even if that would have been what happened, that doesn't explain why Peter dismembered Kim's body. It doesn't explain why he didn't rush back to port and call the police and tell them what happened. It doesn't explain any of that because that's not what happened. What happened is this freak murdered this woman in cold blood because he'd been fantasizing about doing it for decades, because he hates women and he wants to destroy them. By early October, after 50-plus days of searching for Kim's body parts, nothing had been found, so the police hired an oceanographer, an expert on ocean tides, to estimate where Kim's body parts might be found based on where the torso was found. With the help of this oceanographer, progress was made. On the 6th of October, divers found a dumping ground. On the ocean floor, they found several plastic bags, and each of them contained a part of Kim Wall's body. Her head, her legs, her clothing, and the knife used to cut her up were all recovered. Kim's head was completely intact. There was no injury of any kind to her head. Peter Madsen was alerted to the discovery, and so, like any manipulative sociopath, he changed his story. He said he was on the deck of the submarine and Kim was inside. There was a malfunction and the hull began to fill with exhaust fumes. Peter claims he went to the hatch to open the door, but it was stuck, and by the time he got it open, Kim was dead inside from carbon monoxide poisoning. My hell, it is like unbelievable the stuff these guys can come up with, right? He must really think he's so much smarter than everyone else to be slinging that line of bullshit, right? Like anyone is going to believe that. It's just incredible. But their egos are so big, they think they can talk their way out of anything. Oh, and by the way, he also said he's a hero because, you see, the reason he lied about Kim's death the first time, saying her skull was crushed, was to spare her family the gruesome details of hearing about how she suffocated from poisonous gas. Having your skull crushed is not gruesome? Peter, bro, give us a break. In mid-October, Peter Madsen announced he would no longer cooperate with police and he would no longer take part in his own trial. Textbook narcissist, when they can't control the narrative, they control the situation by refusing to participate. Peter Madsen was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and it revealed what we already know. He has narcissistic and sociopathic tendencies, and he has a severe lack of empathy for others. He enjoys seeing people in pain, and he has little to no sense of guilt. At Peter's final trial in April of 2018, all of the information came out about what was found on Peter's computer. Shocked and disgusted, those words don't cover what people felt. People simply could not believe that this celebrity, this nationally celebrated inventor, was a beast. He was a psycho, watching the worst of the worst things human beings do to not only each other, but specifically to women. The disturbing text messages that he sent to the friend of his were read in court, and people sat in horror as line by line, things like, "I'll pierce you with a skewer," and then the hobby knife comes out. "I look for the pulse in your neck." Just sickening things being said in open court. It was awful, and I'm sure it was especially awful for Kim's family. But on April 25th, the final trial came to a conclusion. Peter Madsen was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. They do not hand down life sentences in Denmark very often. They're usually reserved for serial killers. Now, in Denmark, life means 16 years with the possibility of parole after that. It's a very different place over there. But hey, they're doing something right. They're kicking our butts in every category, from education to quality of life, so maybe we should look at their justice system too. In October of 2020, Peter Madsen proved just what a madman he is once again. He got into a physical altercation with a prison employee and escaped from jail. Peter, ever the engineer, had fashioned a device that looked like a bomb and strapped it to his waist. He convinced prison guards that he had rigged it to blow, and he got away. Here is some footage of this little worm running and taking police on an almost kindergarten-like little chase that lasted only a few minutes. Kind of had to stop myself from putting the Benny Hill music to it. After a short standoff, Peter was captured and returned to prison. Since Peter's arrest and the discovery that he is, in fact, a monster, those who knew him have come forward and admitted that yes, Peter had always behaved poorly. He always treated people badly, and he always targeted women especially. He targeted them and he hated them, and poor Kim Wall paid the price for all of his hatred, but it wasn't like there weren't signs. It's almost like when someone is very talented or very charismatic, we all make excuses for them, right? We see the red flags, but we ignore them because the person is especially pretty or especially funny or especially smart. It's almost like we do that, isn't it? That's because, my friends, we do. We do it all the time. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon to support me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.